Alright, so today I'll be talking about triggers and alarms for referral of a patient to tertiary ICU. So, this is a general topic that would be of use for people who may be intending to refer patients to a tertiary ICU or to any other physicians dealing with intensive care, critically ill patients who may need referral to ICU. So, this is a hospital where we work. So, this is around 200 bedded hospital where we have 35 bedded ICU. So this is an entrance to our temple. So I would call my ICU as a temple where we treat our sick patients. So the topics that I would cover is definition and background. So of what exactly intensive care is about, and is there really a good benefit in patients' outcome by getting them admitted to intensive care and the future of intensive care. And we'll just touch about physiological reserves in a patient that determine outcome when they get admitted to our ICU and its determinants. And we look broadly into what are the broad principles and components of intensive care that govern the care that happens in intensive care. And then we'll go into disease specific as to what are the alarms and triggers any doctor or any physician or any healthcare provider should be aware of in identifying patients with sepsis or identifying triggers in dengue which necessitate referral to ICU, and shortness of breath, how do uh, you know which situation would they refer these patients to ICU and what imminent measures are expected when patient gets short of breath. And we'll touch briefly about deep coma, summary and take home message. So if you look at the definition of intensive care medicine as defined by Society of Critical Care Medicine, it refers to basically intensive care is defined as a multidisciplinary healthcare. It's not one individual taking care of a patient because it involves group of doctors, it involves group of specialists, it involves nursing care, physiotherapy, dietitian, and counselor. So it is a multidisciplinary healthcare specialty that really deals with patients who are threatened with acute life-threatening illness, which may lead to death or severe organ dysfunction or disability. So there are two elements that are central for the development of intensive care medicine. So the first key element which really paved the path for the development is the patients who need life support system in the form of ventilation to sustain their breathing. And it is the second component is to look at the obvious benefits that are conferred by looking after this group of patients in a specialized area. So this whole concept of intensive care evolved from looking after these post-surgical patients in a specialized environment, which was found to have significant benefit in influencing their outcome. So this benefit of looking after sick patients in a specialized area, I think the whole concept of intensive care evolved into patients being looked after in a specialized area where a specialized attention was given in optimizing their care. And this really evolved way back in World War II, where, and the credit goes to Florence Nightingale, where she put all these patients, sick patients or the shock patients in a specialized environment. And when they were looked after, it was found that mortality came down from 42% to 2%. And she created what is called as shock wards, where patients who were profusely bleeding or were traumatized were looked after in a area where they were given this special care and resuscitated. And this was found to significantly reduce the mortality. Okay, so that's how the whole concept of intensive care developed, where there was an assigned place where they were given intensive care in a format that it influenced a good outcome. So the evolution of intensive care medicine, I think there is a greater demand for the intensive care beds because patients are getting a lot more sicker. They have a lot more comorbid problems. So there would be a greater demand, and the need for ICU beds is only increasing. And so the number of beds available to the needs is really not catching up. So with the type of patient cohorts that is evolving. And the reasons are, as I said, increasing age, increasing comorbids, and most importantly, advancement in other specialties because the subspecialties, the surgeons are doing more complicated surgeries, and hematology and oncology. There's a lot of transplants, and patients who do receive chemotherapy, radiotherapy, they do have a lot more complications, a lot more infections needing ICU care, and cardiology doing complicated procedures or cardiothoracic surgery doing. So any of these subspecialties who are doing advanced care, I think these patients need to be looked after in a specialized environment with a committed care, with lot more specialized interventions that happen to influence their good outcome. So this is the way intensive care has evolved over time. And intensive care is no longer limited to four walls. It has reached even to boundaries out of ICU by outreach ICU services. So we have something called a medical emergency team and critical care outreach team. So where these teams are designed to identify sick patients in the ward, pick up the early warning signs and alarms, and get them admitted to ICU, or you do certain interventions to prevent further down spiral so that they don't need to come to ICU. So this is where ICU is progressing. And this would be the typical ICU patient who would be connected to multiple tubes and multiple gadgets. So, so, so the whole concept of critical care or intensive care basically, um, confines to this sort of a philosophy. So our whole internal, there needs to be good harmony in our internal milieu or good equilibrium. So, and that equilibrium or harmony within our body is what will determine the health of an individual. So when there is disruption of this internal milieu, I think that leads to disease, and your body's inability to cope with this imbalance is what leads to multi-organ dysfunction. So this was elucidated way back by Claude Bernard. So this is a stamp issued to commemorate him by Transky. So what we need to understand, the constancy of internal milieu is what is needed to maintain the health of an individual. So when do you say that a patient is critically unwell? So critical illness occurs when your body's adaptive capacity is overwhelmed by the illness and your body is unable to cope with what it has been threatened with. That leads to other organ dysfunction. So typically in ICU, you have two situations. So there is a situation where you're putting on a lot of supports to sustain life, or there is a situation where the modalities that you have put them on is only delaying their death or prolonging his agony. So how do we determine whether what we are doing is right, whether we are putting him on modalities to sustain life or whether we are putting him on modalities to only delay death? I think there are two critical elements that we need to be aware. So we are sustaining life when we are dealing with a disease which is reversible. So I think that is the core element or the critical element that you need to be aware. If you are dealing with a disease which is reversible, then what you are doing by sustaining life may be right. But if you are dealing with a disease which is non-reversible, which is in an advanced stage, which is chronic and where his quality of life is compromised, then the modalities you have put him on to sustain life may be to the effect of delaying death or prolonging his misery and agony. So this is how we look. So we look at the reversibility component of any patient who get admitted to ICU to determine whether the supportive mechanism you put him on would be of help or is it to the effect of prolonging his agony or misery. So that is the core element in our intensive care. So in ICU, we need to be very clear about this physiological reserve because patients come in sick, and what really determines whether they would benefit from all the interventions that you are doing or whether they would benefit from all the support is really dependent on your internal homeostatic capacity. It is the capacity to maintain your internal harmony or your equilibrium within the body in the face of internal or external stresses. What it essentially means is, if you are threatened with a life threatening insult of some nature, whether your body has a good ability to cope and recuperate from that stress. I think that really determines whether your patient is going to get better with all the supportive mechanism or would fail to get better because of his own adaptive mechanisms which are overwhelmed with the stress. So what are the determinants of this homeostatic capacity? Homeostatic is your own internal ability or innate ability to recuperate. I think that is That is a very important determinant of outcome after critical ill, and those are determined by your genetic makeup. Obviously, we do not have control over the genetic, because if your genetic predisposition is to get sicker after a disease and lead to other organ dysfunction, then obviously you wouldn't do well with whatever treatment you give. And obviously, age. If you are dealing with a patient with an advanced age and they are threatened with a life-threatening insult, their ability to cope or recuperate and maintain the internal milieu or harmony or balance would be impaired. And comorbidities. So, if the patient has multiple comorbids which has already compromised their organ function, so their ability to recuperate, respond would be compromised. And nutritional status. So, if patient is malnourished, his response to the disease would be suboptimal, and his ability to recuperate will be compromised. And immunological factors. So, if he has any other autoimmune condition, or if he is immunosuppressed due to steroids or any other medications, or if he is immunosuppressed due to a disease or a background medical condition, so their response also will be suboptimal. And most importantly, psychosocial. So, if psychologically patients resolve, or he has a negative attitude towards the whole disease, or if his psychological makeup is something which is not adapt to him getting better, or if he has a negative vibes about his old disease, and is, I think this we really see in our practice, that if someone is psychologically demotivated or is negative about his disease condition, I think that has a huge bearing on him getting better. So that's why we would encourage, even in intensive care, so we would want to infuse them with a lot of positive vibes. Their whole negative psychological makeup has a detrimental effect on their clinical outcome. I think this is a very important aspect which we try to impart in our ICU caregivers, that we infuse our patients with positive vibes, because that definitely has a bearing on their recovery and well-being. So these are about the host factors. So the genetic factors, nutritional factors, immunological factors, age, comorbid, psychological is about the host. But there are disease factors which obviously we have no control, which nature has inflicted upon. The severity of the disease definitely will influence whether patient is going to get better or sick, and the complications due to the disease. It can be the complications pertaining to the disease, or it may be complications due to the interventions that we do. The side effects or the iatrogenic effects of the medicines or any other invasive procedures we do, all these have bearing on the clinical outcome. And the treatment factors, the time at which the treatment has been initiated, this has a huge bearing, because ordinarily we may have patients saying that, sir, despite doing all the therapy, our patient is not doing well, but they may have come to our center after a significant delay in their clinical presentation, and that definitely has a bearing. So we need to re-emphasize to the patient that, you look here, you have come really late to us after 48 hours after your disease onset, and now obviously that has a very negative bearing or a very unfavorable effect on your outcome. So because the time lag in their presentation definitely has a bearing on their clinical outcome. And targeted therapy, because obviously if you have not established the right diagnosis, then the outcomes also will be detrimental, because we need to establish diagnosis early, so that the treatment that is given is in a very targeted fashion. Because if you miss the target and we are treating erroneously for a misdiagnosis that has been made, that also has a negative bearing on their clinical outcome. And most importantly, response to treatment. Like I always tell in my ICU, that you treat 10 patients of same comorbids, same age, and the same disease, the response by 10 individuals will be in a 10 different ways. So how each one responds to treatment is really dependent on their innate uh, mechanisms, or innate sort of a immunological response, or innate sort of a response from the whole body to the treatment that you are giving. So that also is determined really on the host factors. So that's about the determinants as to how patient would respond. So it is really dependent on his own host sort of a factors, and on the disease factors, which is effectively the severity of the disease, the time lag, and the response to the treatment based on his genetic or immunological makeup. So how do we basically treat a patient when patient comes to ICU? So roughly, if you look at it, so as soon as patient comes to ICU, we generally give supportive. So we don't start taking history clinical. So if there is an imminent danger to his life, we need to give supportive treatment with measures to sustain his life, which is essentially airway, breathing, and circulation. So when patient comes to intensive care, our first step is to give him supportive care to safeguard his life by taking care of his airway. So obviously, if he's not maintaining airway, we would intubate. If he's not breathing well, we would support his ventilation by assisted ventilation. And if he's hemodynamically very unstable, we would support him with fluid resuscitation and vessels. So this is the first step in our ICU care. And the second step would be obviously to plan treatment. To plan treatment, I think the key elements is once you have stabilized the patient with supportive elements, then you would obviously take history and clinical examination, and all these happen concurrently. So we would resuscitate him first, stabilize him first, then take history, clinical examination concurrently, and build up differential diagnosis, plan a diagnostic workup, and then you would then try to prioritize which patient needs to be, because if you have 10 patients in ICU, so you would prioritize and see who is the sickest patient and treatment instituted ISAP in an emergent way in someone who is on a high priority. And as I said, in ICU, it's not only about stabilization, establishing diagnosis and treatment, it is also about taking preventative steps. So ICU is all about even taking preventive steps to prevent spread of infection from one person to another and to curtail the risk of hospital acquired infection. So this is in essence the whole functionary of ICU. As soon as patient comes, we do stabilization, then we take history, clinical examination in a concurrent fashion, send appropriate investigation workup, prioritize the patient, and institute the treatment. Along with this, we would take preventative steps to prevent spread of the infections amongst the patients. So, putting all this in a nutshell, I think our whole ICU functioning would be to integrate all these three variables. So, integrate your clinical examination and history taking, and obviously any patient who comes to ICU, we would connect them to monitor. So we integrate all the monitored variables, and then along with this, after having taken history, clinical examination, stabilizing, connecting to monitor, we would send a lot of investigative workup. So we would have to integrate the blood profile and the radiological profile and any other ancillary investigations like ECG, echoes, and other things. So we put in all this information together into one capsule, and then you plan what the diagnosis is and establish what the diagnosis is and plan treatment. So this is in essence the way ICU works. And as I've already mentioned, I think ICU we deal with 236 variables at any point of time. So it's really like a pilot. So we have to have a 360-degree approach to all the elements that we look into. So it is said that in a very sick patient, we really look close to 200 to 236 variables at any point of time. When I say 236, it involves all the historical tidbits, your clinical profile that you have created, and all the monitored variables and all the investigative modalities that we keep looking at any point of time. So, just to briefly sensitize you about our Columbia Asia statistics, so I think for the audience here or for people who are hearing to this, I think this is the rough breakup of the type of patients that come to our ICU. So this is all the medical patients. So we have roughly around 1000 to 1200 admissions per year. And if you look at it, our predominant admissions would be infection, as you see, and that has been increasing over the years. And the second commonest medical admission was neurology patients. And after that, you would get all the other systems. And as you see, respiratory also was pretty high on our list, sepsis and poisoning. So these were the commoner sort of an ICU admissions that we had in our hospital. So it's mainly infections, neurology, respiratory, sepsis, and poisoning. These were the commoner entities. And if you look at our crude mortality rate, it was around 7.96%, which is reasonable. And the mortality was highest in sepsis group, followed by neurology group. When I say neurology, it may be strokes, bad strokes, or it may be meningoencephalitis or venous sinus thrombosis. And the oncology also was high, followed by respiratory. So this is a statistical breakup of our patient input. And if you look at the surgical cohort, I think neurosurgery patients were more in our hospital, followed by general surgery and trauma. And if you look at the mortality, surgical mortality is lesser than medical mortality. It was around 5% crude mortality. and the mortality was highest in neurosurgical. So when I say neurosurgical, it would be all traumatic brain injuries also, followed by general surgery patients. So if you look at our total the stratification, which is the common group of ICU admissions, you would see 71% of our ICU admissions are medical patients, and around 29% are our surgical patients. If you look at crude mortality rate, as I mentioned, the overall mortality is 7.2%. In medical patients, it's around close to 8%. In surgical patients, the mortality is around 5%. So we'll move into the sepsis as a sort of a patient group or a cohort which you would refer to ICU. So we would just touch about this new sepsis definition which came in JAMA 2016, and this definition was endorsed by ESICM and Society of Critical Care Medicine, and now it is sent out to around 31 societies for endorsements. So the definition, the new definition of sepsis for all the audience to understand is it's a life-threatening organ dysfunction due to dysregulated host response to infection. So why this definition is important in the light of all the preamble that I gave about the host response is really even the whole definition of sepsis boils down to how a patient responds to an infection, because which means to say, so there is a appreciation of this fact that every individual responds differently to the infection, and when the response is not appropriate or when it is not regulated, that is when it can lead to organ dysfunction. So it pretty much boils down to the basic essence of our understanding of host response. So, and when the SOFA score or sequential organ failure assessment score is more than or equal to 2, it is shown that mortality is more than 10% in sepsis. And what is the definition of septic shock? Septic shock is same as this, life-threatening organ dysfunction due to dysregulated host response, along with where patient's blood pressure is low, and you are needed to start him or her on vasopressors to maintain blood pressure, and where lactate is more than 2 millimoles. So any patient with dysregulated host response to infection leading to organ dysfunction and needing vasopressors, I think you would call them as septic shock. And when you find someone with septic shock where they are needing vasopressors to maintain blood pressure, mortality can be more than 40%. So the new sepsis definition has come out with QSOFA score. So QSOFA is a tool to identify patients in the wards who may be early sepsis and who may need admission to ICU. So QSOFA of 2 necessitates ICU admission, or there may be patients who are early sepsis, and treatment and investigations has to be instituted sooner than later. So what is QSOFA? Any patients with altered mental status whose respiratory rate is more than 22 or systolic blood pressure is less than 100. So any two of these three, if a patient has, then a suspicion or an antenna has to raise in a doctor that this could be possible sepsis, and they need to be sent to ICU to improve their outcomes. So what we have gained in the last few years is our increased understanding of sepsis pathobiology. So what we have understood is sepsis is not only about pro-inflammatory activity, it is about activation of both pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cascade in the body, and having a good balance between pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cascade that has set in. I think that remains very critical to understanding of sepsis. So if there is imbalance of either pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, there is overwhelming pro-inflammatory cascade or overwhelming anti-inflammatory cascade, or if there is underwhelming anti-inflammatory cascade as a response to pro-inflammatory, all this leads to organ dysfunction. So basically the key thing is to have a harmony, to have a balance between pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory mediators. And as we clearly understand, what is most important in sepsis is the patient's response. And what we have realized is patient's response is very heterogeneous. And as we have already discussed, it is dependent on age, it is dependent on comorbidities, and it is even dependent on the type of surgery or any other invasive intervention that he has undergone. And his response, his or her response is really dependent on all the medicine the patient is already on. If the patient is on steroids, his response may be suboptimal. Or if the patient is on some immunosuppressants, his response may be suboptimal. So we need to take into light all the medications that he may be on, and most importantly source of infection, because if the source of infection is lung, I think the response will be very different when compared to another source. Like if the source is urine, his response may be very different. So these are all the determining factors as to how each individual would respond to different sources of infection, or to various other comorbidities they have, or to various other interventions they may have undergone, or depending on all the medicines they may be on. So that's about sepsis in nutshell. So it is only to sensitize as to the new definition of sepsis and what are the determinants that influence his response and his likely outcome. I think what are the determining factors. I think if you keep that in back of your mind, it would be easy for you to sort of approach a patient with sepsis and even help you in counseling. So let's look into the dengue. I think most physicians here would be treating dengue. I think the critical aspect of dengue is to understand what are the warning signs. So any dengue patient with the bleeding manifestations, I think that is an alarm. I think they are the patients who should raise an antenna that they need to be sent to a higher center or to a good ICU, or to be managed better and to prevent death. So any dengue patients whose hematocrit or PCV is more than 45 is an alarm. So it's an alarm to indicate that his fluid resuscitation has to be a lot more aggressive, and it is an alarm that this patient need to be managed in ICU. So any dengue patients whose liver enzymes SGO2, SGPOT or AST/ALT is very high, is in thousands. It is a good indicator to say that it is life threatening, and this patient needs to be sent to ICU for further care. So liver enzymes are an important marker of severity of dengue. Or dengue where lactates are high. If lactate is more than 2 in a dengue patient, so it is an indication that his microcirculatory status is severely impaired, and he is at a risk of multi-organ dysfunction. And if you see a dengue patients where lactate is more than 10, more than 2, sorry, so they need to be referred to a good ICU for aggressive care. Or any dengue with altered sensorium. I think that is also a very serious thing. So if you see a dengue patient who is in encephalopathy, I think that is a very ominous sign. So we've had patients who are admitted with dengue encephalopathy, and their outcomes can be disastrous if they're not managed appropriately. So let's quickly look into how we ascertain the mortality and how our ICU has performed with regards to the mortality. So we look at something called SMR, so which is called standardized mortality rate. So it is simply observed mortality divided by predicted mortality. So we use tools like Apache to determine what the possible mortality of a patient would be, and observed mortality is what is looking at our mortality rates in our ICU. So if your SMR is 1, it means that you are performing as expected. If SMR is more than 1, it means patients are dying more than what you would have predicted, because when you predict they should not have died, but in reality they have died. So if it is more than 1, it means that your ICU needs to improve in its performance, and it needs to improve the quality indicators. If SMR is less than 1, then you know your ICU is performing better, because you have predicted that he would die but he has not died, which means you are doing something better in preventing the death. So this is just to sensitize as to how we look at uh, the performance of our ICU, and this is to sensitize you to determine which ICU is a good ICU. Because when I say you have to refer these patients to a good ICU, then you need to know which ICU is good. So when I say which ICU is good, you need to have these elements of um, SMR being documented in that ICU. So we did this study in Columbia, Asia, where we looked at 127 patients who were admitted to ICU with sepsis. And as you see, our mean age of was 60 plus or minus 16.51, and we had more male septic patients as compared to females, 1.4 is to 1, and our average ICU length of stay was 5.18 plus or minus 4.64 days, and our death was around 28, so it was 22 point. If you look at worldwide reported mortality in sepsis, it's around 20 to 50%. So our mortality was uh, in the lower reference value, which is 20%, and we had around 8 damas. So, or 44.8% of them were diabetics in our study. So when you look at our mean risk of death, it was 49. So this is the estimated, so which was the predicted mortality. But our actual mortality was only 17.21. So when we calculated our adjusted SMR, it was only 0.44, which was less than 1. So which means our ICU was performing better than what it is expected. So patients who were predicted as that they would die based on our Apache score did survive, which means obviously we were putting in our best quality indicators and doing possibly good care to influence their good outcome. So this is what it means. And once we get the SMR, we benchmark it to the worldwide ICUs. As you see, these are all the ICUs indexed worldwide, and these are all the these are all the SMRs of different ICUs. And if you see our range 0.44, it falls somewhere in the top bracket. So which means our ICU is benchmarked to some of the good ICUs, good benchmarked ICUs worldwide. So that's what would qualify any ICU as good ICU. So if you are referring a sick patient to a ICU which you believe is good, then the first question one needs to ask is what is your SMR? Because if they have not calculated SMR, then none of us here would be able to vouch how is their performance. I think that is the key element. So we just move to the shortness of breath. So this is the reason why we picked up sepsis is the common cause of ICU admission. If you see in the first table I showed you, it was predominantly our infections, sepsis, and respiratory failure. So any patient who comes with respiratory failure, what are the differentials? Pulmonary edema is one of the commonest cause of admission to ICU, which may be due to heart failure or chronic kidney disease, or pneumonia, or acute lung injury, ARDS, and sepsis. All these three can have shortness of breath, which may need ICU admission, on COPD, because this is the commonest cause of ICU admission. So I think the reason they come to ICU is not for oxygen, because oxygen is present in any hospital, oxygen may be present in the body. They come to ICU mainly for ventilation. Why is it important? I think the key component that one needs to understand is anyone who comes with short of breath in ICU, along with oxygen, what they get is non-invasive ventilation. And why do they need non-invasive ventilation? Because if you give only oxygen in pneumonia, acute lung injury, pulmonary edema, or COPD, it would not solve this problem of ventilation perfusion mismatch or shunt fraction. By giving non-invasive ventilation, you are reducing the shunt fraction, reducing the ventilation perfusion mismatch, you are recruiting the alveoli in pulmonary edema by giving intrinsic PEEP, and you are reducing the work of breathing. So these are the advantages which non-invasive ventilation will provide, which normal oxygen will not be able to provide. So this is the essence. So with any short of breath, I think they have no business to remain in the ward. They need to come to ICU so that they get this non-invasive ventilation to tide over all these elements which are affected. And most importantly, non-invasive ventilation reduces afterload, which is very useful in heart failure, because there is a tremendous load on the heart and you need to reduce the afterload, and that is achieved with medicines along with non-invasive ventilation. So what are the different non-invasive ventilation we give? So we need to understand the science of this non-invasive, because non-invasive is not just sticking a non-invasive ventilator or BiPAP. So you need to understand what really CPAP is, what really pressure support ventilation is, what really is BiPAP, bi-level positive airway pressure, and we need to understand the concept of non-invasive positive pressure. So obviously this is beyond the scope of this talk. So I think one needs to attend some workshop to understand these concepts of different modalities in non-invasive ventilation. So how did we perform in our Columbia Asia with non-invasive? Because as I was see, the use of non-invasive is a quality indicator, it's a structure indicator. And we did an audit of our 318 patients admitted to our ICU in 2011 to see how many patients needed non-invasive. As you see, in respiratory, we had 115 patients who got NIV, 115 patients who got admitted, out of which 46 of them got NIV. Around 40% of the respiratory cases got NIV, and 102 septic patients, around 20% got NIV support. And nephrology, basically they all chronic kidney disease who came with pulmonary edema, around 17% got NIV, and cardiology around 27% got NIV. And providing NIV in pulmonary edema, in heart failure, and in COPD is a quality indicator. As you see, the benchmark is 95% of the COPD exacerbation should get NIV trial before even you think of intubating, and that's a quality benchmark. If we are not providing or if we are not assisting them with NIV or non-invasive ventilation, it means that we are not providing quality care in intensive care. So this is the so basically the take-home message with this is any patients with short of breath, if they are not settling with oxygen supplementation involved, they need to come to ICU to get non-invasive ventilation, which is a quality indicator. So we'll quickly move to deep coma. So any ICU dealing with deep coma should be sensitized to this concept of brain death. So brain death is death. So I think that is the essence that I want every uh, person listening to this to understand. So brain death is where there's loss of all the brainstem activity, and that essentially is equal to death. So it is cessation of all the brainstem and the cortical functions. So the general etiology which leads to this sort of cessation of all brainstem reflexes are severe traumatic brain injury, subarachnoid hemorrhage, or massive stroke or massive hemorrhage, or severe hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, or massive strokes, ischemic strokes. So these are some of the common conditions which lead to irreversible loss of brainstem reflexes, which is equal to brain dead. So the prerequisites to say a patient is brain dead is we need to know the etiology. If etiology is not known, then it is very hard to label someone as brain dead, and we need to exclude any other medical conditions that may be complicating the deep coma, that may be adding on to the deep coma. And patient should not be hypothermic. Temperature should be more than 36 degree. Patient should not have any endocrine problem, should not have any thyroid hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, or should not have any electrolyte abnormalities, should not have acid-base balance, and should not be hypotensive. His systolic blood pressure should be more than 100. So these are the prerequisites to embark on doing tests to determine that this patient may be possible brain dead. So you should have all this fulfilled before you embark on conducting brainstem testing to determine if he is brain dead. And he should not be on any sedatives, opioids, okay, or he should not have any toxin on board. So I think these are the prerequisites to move to the next step of determining whether he is brain dead by performing brainstem function tests. So how do you confirm brainstem death? So you can look at the pupillary light reflex. So there will be the direct and consensual pupillary light reflex is lost. So that is one of the brainstem reflex you would look into. The second one is you would look into corneal reflex. So absence of corneal reflex is another one you would take in. So all these reflexes should be absent. So the direct and consensual light reflex should be absent. Corneal reflex should be absent. Then you would look at oculocephalic reflex, where you move the head to one side, the the pupil moves to the other side, and and so when there is no contralateral movement of the pupils, I think that's when you would say that oculocephalic reflex is absent. Or vestibulo-ocular reflex, so where you put the cold water, ideally you will have movement of the pupils to the eyes to the same side. If you have warm water, it moves to the opposite side. So if this reflex is absent, then you would say oculovestibular reflex is absent. Then you would look at gag reflex. So if gag reflex is absent, that would qualify, that is another qualifier to say that patient is brain dead. Or gag reflex or cough reflex. Cough reflex, most of the brain dead patients, not most, all the brain dead patients, you would expect that they would be on a ventilator. So you can do a cough test, you can do a suction. I think that's the simplest way. You do a suction. If there is no suction reflex, then you would say your cough reflex is absent. And the fourth one is the last one is the apnea test. So I think we can go in very briefly about apnea test, but you need to really practice this to understand what this is. So basically you put patient on 100% oxygen for 10 minutes, then you do a blood gas, and then if blood oxygenation is very good, you discontinue ventilator. So discontinue ventilator, you put them only on oxygen catheter or TPs for at around 12 liters per minute. You wait for around 8 to 10 minutes approximately. And throughout this procedure, make sure that his saturation does not drop less than 95%. And we repeat ABG after 10 minutes and see if the CO2 is more than 60 or 20 above the baseline. So the first ABG, if it shows PCO2 of 45, the second ABG you do after apnea test should have CO2 more than 65, 20 rise. So, but there should be a doctor present whenever this apnea test is happening, because very often we see when you disconnect them from ventilator and put them only on a oxygen catheter, we could see drop in oxygenation, or they could even be hemodynamic compromise. They can be drop in blood pressure. So the complication rate is being reported as 10 to 26%. So, and many patients may say, sir, you said patient is brain dead, but I see there is some movement. So there are a lot of abnormal movements that can happen in brain dead, which can all be spinally mediated. These are all the reflexes not mediated from the brain or brainstem. Like they can have twitching of the facial muscles, they can have flexor spasms of the neck, there can be flexor spasms in the trunk also, which is called Lazarus sign. There can be flexor or supination and pronation within in the hands as well. There can be triple flexion. There can be flexion at the hip, flexion at the knee joint. There can be flexion at the ankle, which we call it as triple flexion, which is also spinal mediated. So it is not brainstem mediated. Or there can be flexion extension of the foot. So all these are considered as spinally mediated reflexes, because very often family can come back and ask you there was some movement of the hand, he held my hand. So these are all spinally mediated and they are not of much significance. So you need to be very clear and be aware of these spinally mediated reflexes. So how did Columbia Asia perform with organ donation? So if you look at our organ donation, 2010 to 12, I think our neurology 9 patients contributed to brain dead, 10 were brain dead, and 2 donated organs, and it was 10.5% was the conversion rate. And that significantly increased in 2013 to 2015. So we have just divided every 3 years. As you see, it was 25%. From 2016 till date, we are already 37.5%. So our organ donation rates have very sequentially been increasing over the course of time, and this is thanks to the education that we impart to our whole team, to the nursing staff and our doctor team. So, and our counseling, effective counseling, all these together have led to increase in the organ donation rate. And in fact, we have reported this organ donation conversion rate, and this percentage 37.5% is a very good, and this is comparable to the world statistics, and you can go through this journal. So we have reported this study as a letter to editor to sensitize about the organ donation rates that prevail in our hospital and in our country. So the take home message of this talk is the traditional medical and surgical models is insufficient for ICU patients. So which means to say ICU care is really an evolved care. It's a multidisciplinary care, and one needs to go through a structured training program to impart this high-end care to our patients to improve outcomes. So the key element of ICU is being very methodical. As I said, you would be looking at 236 variables at any point of time, and if you are not methodical, so you would be lost. So one needs to have good clarity how we are methodical, how we integrate those clinical monitored investigative modalities at every given point of time, so that our decision making will be a lot more accurate, and our ability to establish diagnosis will be a lot more effective. And early recognition, I think the key take home message is, I think every doctor needs to be sensitized to recognize these early triggers or warning signs or alarms, so that appropriate referral to good ICU happens, and so that their outcomes also are much better and optimized. And the key element is teamwork. In ICU, it is not about one person making a difference, it is a teamwork. So you need to involve each and every healthcare delivery personnel that is involved in your ICU to be a part of decision making. So we have to work with our nursing team along with our physiotherapy, our dietitians, our counselors, and all the doctors present to package or to have an effective care and improve our outcomes. So I think people who are interested should read about this team science and critical care. This really talks about all the core elements that determines effective team science that has to be put in place for good functioning of ICU. So I would end my talk with this saying: until you change your thinking, you will always recycle your experiences. So I think it is about time to rethink about the way how ICUs function. It is time to rethink about how we put the data together to determine how our ICU is performing and how it can be benchmarked to the global ICUs to provide good care to our patients and improve their outcomes. So thank you very much.